Welcome to our conversation series webinar for today on the topic A Quest for a New Business Model for Journalism. First thing first, please stay muted throughout the conversation, and also request you, if you're using names like Lenovo, etc., request you to join with your own name so that it helps us in identifying you towards the end if you have any questions. Now, our guest speaker for today is Rohin Dharmakumar, co-founder and CEO of The Ken. The Ken, very well-known new age subscription-based digital publication based in Bangalore. It has, in the last 5 years, grown drastically when it comes to providing very customized, well-researched analytical news stories to their readers. Rohin, who is the co-founder, he completed his postgraduate diploma in management from IIM Calcutta in 2001, post which he has had a diverse experience in communications and PR related support to the top management teams in driving business, especially in the consulting and tech industry. And then he has also served as the editor of telecom, media, and entertainment for the Forbes. He has a very good knack for understanding and building businesses based on what the consumer wants. And that's why he had his own startup, Owntastic, followed by The Ken, which is providing customized news for the reader. And given all his background, we thought, why not have someone from the university who is also an expert on consumer insights. So we have Professor Ravi Meglani from Ahmedabad University, who will be engaging in a conversation with Rohin today. Professor Meglani is a professor of practice of management at Ahmedabad University and also the director of executive and continuing education at Ahmedabad University. And he has an over 35 years of experience in marketing research, in market research and consumer insights. And he runs a very unique interdisciplinary course at the university on understanding consumers when it comes to understanding consumers' choice at the system one brain level. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Professor Ravi Meglani to take the conversation forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Swati, and welcome, Rohin, once again. And thanks for coming here.
Thank you, Swati and Ravi.
Okay, so we will talk about the wider media landscape and the various business models in it. But before that, just to place you and your organization in that landscape, many of our audience may not be very familiar. So could you give us a short history of The Ken? What is The Ken? Why did you come about? And what was the gap, or what was the problem that you were looking to solve? And have you solved it?
Sure. I'll answer the last question first. No, we haven't solved it yet. I think all startups and businesses are ongoing works in progress. We are too. Very briefly, The Ken is a subscribers only digital news publication. We started in October 2016 from Bangalore. And we are subscribers only, and we focus on a very limited set of topics that we cover, largely business, internet, healthcare, entrepreneurship, telecom, fintech, right? And our model when we started was also fairly simple. It was that we would write only for subscribers, and we would only write one story a day and nothing more than that. So that was our model when we started out. And you asked me, why did we kind of start this? And, the reason for that was really, I don't want to kind of retrofit a clever explanation for what we did, but it was really, we wanted to do journalism, meaningful business journalism. So Seema Singh, who's my co-founder, and who's our editor at The Ken, and I were colleagues at Forbes India as journalists. And then there's Sumant, who's our third co-founder. The reason why we started was because we loved writing, we loved doing longer, more interesting business journalism. And to us, the model, the simplest model that we could essentially pull off as a small team was subscriptions. We were clear that we didn't want to chase the advertising funded model for all the complications and issues that it brings around, like conflicts of interest, etc., and all of that. And therefore, I think the purest model for us was that, hey, if you're only doing writing for subscribers, we can keep our costs low to start with. And I think that's very important. We were very clear that we didn't want to start by setting up a massive newsroom and try to figure out how to fund that through advertising and scale. So that's why we started the Ken. We, just to kind of recap, it's like, can we do the kind of journalism that we enjoy doing? And what's the simplest model that allows us to get that, which was a subscription model, right? Like, reduced to its elements, it's like, in any business, if you're creating a product or a service, can you charge customers for it? In journalism, that sounds very radical, but really that's like if you distill any business model, it's like you produce a valuable good or service and you sell it to a customer. That's what we aim to do. Today, we have over 30,000 paying subscribers across India, Southeast Asia, and the rest of the world. We started from India, and last year we expanded to Southeast Asia as well, where we have colleagues in 5 Southeast Asian countries right now.
Great. Yeah, I mean, that is the $1,000,000 question: is journalism a product, and can it be sold like any other goods and service for a price to the end user rather than to an intermediary like an advertiser? And that is a thing that we often think we used to pay for journalism in the good old days when we bought our newspapers for 5 rupees. 5 rupees didn't pay for journalism. The advertising still paid. The cover price of a newspaper never paid for the journalism that went into the newspaper. So, but you now think that journalism is a product and worth selling for its own sake?
Yes, we deeply and strongly believe in this. And to be frank, I don't think it's that new or radical a concept as well, because I think the roots of journalism, always lied in there is information that exists in the world which someone reports, puts together, and presents and sells to people, those who want to consume it, right? So that was the original model of journalism and newspapers when it started. Till, of course, people figured out that, if you do it at scale, it's advertisers who are interested in reaching the people who are reading rather than, right? So then that became the dominant business model. But to your question, Ravi, I think at the Ken, we are huge believers in first principles thinking. So when someone asks us, is journalism a product? Can it be sold? The way we approach it is that, is journalism valuable? If you're making something valuable, will people pay for it? Is it a product? And for us, all of those questions always resoundingly end up in a yes. If you're producing something of value, surely there must be people who value it and will pay for it as well, right? Why should it be different for journalism? Now, we could argue about who are the people you're producing it for and what is the price that they want to pay for it, etc. But I think the fundamental question of, is it a product? Should people pay for it? I don't think that's in any doubt at all.
Great. So that gives us a good idea of where you stand in this bigger landscape. So let's slowly start zooming out into the bigger landscape. So in the past 2 decades, especially since the advent of Google and then Facebook and Twitter and so on, we have somehow got it into our heads that news should be free, that on a couple of clicks on Google search or clicking a tweet on Twitter, I should be able to know what's going on in the world, and why do I need to pay for it? And that model meant that someone has to pay for it. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So someone had to pay for producing journalism. So if we refuse to pay, the models were either advertisers pay, which is the core model of social media and Google search and so on, and YouTube and everything, or it is supported by someone with deep pockets, a business house, which a lot of Indian media is owned by large business houses, and that comes with its own baggage. As we know, business houses have commercial and political agendas, and they might want to sneak those agendas into the editorial content of the media houses they own. So those were the two dominant and are the two dominant ways in which journalism is paid for. So what makes you believe that you, sorry, a small guy, not the big media houses, can upset this apple cart?
So I don't believe we are the ones who are going to upset this apple cart. I think this is a secular trend that's been playing out all over the world. The New York Times has over 8 million paying subscribers. Wall Street, like I think the FT crossed 1 million paying subscribers in 2019. I don't remember the exact numbers of Wall Street Journal, but it's in the millions as well. It's not just news that people are paying for. We pay today subscriptions. We have subscriptions for Netflix. We have subscriptions for music. We have subscriptions to storage services. We have subscriptions to photo services. We have subscriptions to food delivery services. So, I mean, the point being that subscriptions is not all that radical. More and more of us are paying for it. B, paying for news as a subscription is also not that radical, right? Like I gave the example of New York Times, Wall Street Journal, etc. 3, and I think the point that you made is that that Indian consumers didn't want, or consumers didn't want to pay for news. I think more of the blame lies with the way traditional media evolved. So it was never that consumers were given a choice that do you want to pay for quality news or do you want something else for free? What essentially happened in India, especially, is that once the default business model for newspapers became ad funded and it became, I think we're all aware of how Times of India led the innovation of reducing newspaper prices to essentially gain scale, and everyone else soon copied that. That essentially meant that most of news in India became a monoculture where the same business model got replicated. So as a consumer, it wasn't that consumer said, I refuse to pay for quality news. It was just that the default business model changed to that. That said, I think there were pockets where consumers were paying for news. For example, business news magazines or specialist subscriptions and stuff like that. But I think over time, even those fell by because obviously the disruption of print and the entire concept of magazines itself is moot today. So I would actually argue that we have to essentially blame largely ourselves as the media industry for changing consumer behavior and associating news with this is not something that you need to pay for. It was not a behavioral change that emanated from the consumer side. Instead, it was the industry that said that you don't need to pay for this. Don't worry, we've got this.
So you think since this need to get free news was not kind of driven from the bottom up, it wasn't a kind of consumer demand, that mindsets can change and people will start to believe in paywalls and subscriptions.
Absolutely. Now the question is, whenever we have this discussion around subscriptions, we always tend to view all of India and all of news consumers as some kind of a monolith. It's like today, nobody wants to pay for news. Is the future that everybody will pay for news, right? So it's not a binary. If you look at us, for instance, our ambition, even in our wildest dreams, is not to convince everyone to pay for news. That's never going to happen. But our point is that those people for whom business news is valuable, we are writing for them. What percentage of them can we convert and get them to pay for our? And we're obviously just one example. There are people who do great sports journalism. There are people who do great political journalism, etc. Right? Like, so the Wire, News Laundry, for instance, like, I'm subscribers to both. I'm a subscriber to both of them. So the question that quality media or journalism houses need to ask is that who are we going after? What's our customer segment, and will they pay for? Your objective is not to convince the world to your point of view. There are no points for trying to do that. I mean, in fact, that's a battle that no one's ever going to win.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right. It's not either or. There's room for all business models. Just in every other sphere, there is free music, and there's Spotify. There is free entertainment, and there's Netflix, and so on. So there will always be different kinds of business models, and even the so-called successful subscription-based news outlets, like you mentioned earlier, the New York Times and Wall Street Journal or The Economist and so on, have both models. And I don't remember how many, but you read on New York Times, and after your third article for the month or the fifth article of the month, a paywall comes up, and you're not allowed to read more than 3 or 5.
I mean, that's nothing. Like, even if you're a paying subscriber, you get to see ads. So that's so there is. It's not that being a subscriber to the New York Times ensures that you will never see an ad. I can say that. Like, so.
Yeah.
But I think it's a transition. They've now reached a stage where subscription revenue is higher than advertising revenue. And I think, like you said, on a continuum, you're moving away from ad-funded business models towards directly subscriber-funded business models, right? Now, will that ever become 100-0? Perhaps it will for some, perhaps it won't for some, and that's all right, I think.
Yeah, and also in the last 2 or 3 years, with all the kind of drama around consumer data protection and some high-profile cases like Facebook and so on, getting into trouble with misusing or mishandling consumer data, that awareness that by free, we don't mean free, we are paying for it by our data, and people are harvesting our data and putting it to use, which I don't have complete visibility on. So people are beginning to realize that there's no free news. You pay for it one way or the other. And more and more people will come around to the idea of paying directly rather than through being targeted by advertising or whatever. So yeah, so there will always be
That's
that.
A great point. Yeah, you made, Ravi, because when you pay for news, it's not, of course, like, as a subscriber, you're directly, saying that, like, I value this product, therefore I'm paying for it, which means that the publisher also feels that, like, someone's paying me for it, so I've got to make sure that it's really good, right? But I think the important byproduct is that for especially subscription-based media companies, we have no incentive to collect all sorts of data on our subscribers. What's their age? What's their marital status? What's their location? What's their income level? What articles are they reading, etc. Right? So we don't collect any of that, right? And that's I mean, right now, I think it's a byproduct, but at some point, and for a sizable percentage of people, that will become important and a deciding factor in its own right.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And that, I think, is becoming visible to more and more, not just in like news media, but in others. Even lately, you must be familiar. There have been attempts to get into subscription-based search engines. There is this search engine called Neeva, which has been set up by one of
former Google people. That's right.
Yeah, former Google guy who used to run the ad business of search for 20 years, or he founded that business, has moved on and started a subscription-based search engine called Neeva, which again makes the same point that because we are not, we don't need your data, we don't collect your data, and therefore because we are not answerable to an advertiser, we are answerable to our subscribers. What shows up on your search is what you need, and not if you search for television, you don't get hundreds of people trying to sell televisions to you. You get some serious news about television or whatever product you're searching for. And that's happening in a lot of places. Twitter recently started piloting Twitter Blue, which is like a subscription-based Twitter in some countries. Again, probably with the same intention of providing subscriber value without kind of being desperate for subscriber data. So yeah, so that's, I think at that stage, it might be useful to kind of, while we've been using the word news kind of generically, there is news as in a plane crashed this morning here and a protest happened outside that politician's house, or a cyclone has hit in this coastal area. That is facts. And then there is views or opinions. So when we're talking about serious journalism, you are, I guess, talking about views more than news, because news is now past the stage of being able to be charged for. I don't need a journalist to tell me that a plane crashed. Within seconds, I see it on Twitter that a plane crashed. What I need is to understand why it crashed, what were the safety issues, what were the weather issues, what was the pilot issues, what was the airline issues, et cetera, et cetera. So I need to understand the why behind the what, and that's why we pay for it, right? Not pay for telling me what happened.
So once again, I'll go back to that point that we discussed earlier, that like, I mean, it's a continuum. And I'd like to say that news is important as well. For instance, like, I mean, I get like 2-3 newspapers every day at home, and I really rely on them to make sense of like, all these things that you said and more, right? Like, what's happening in the world. I just want to know. And I think that's a really valuable service that newspapers provide. Just like, the act of like, having reporters all over the country who are explaining what's happening. So that's one. And I think it's really valuable. I also want to make the point that it's not the job of the newspaper is not just to kind of collate and present everything, because no newspaper can tell you all the news that's happening in the world. But I think what they choose to show you and where they choose to show you or how they choose to show you, right? The curation of news is very important. For instance, I mean, a significant protest could have happened outside a politician's house, and one newspaper may choose to kind of write about it. Another may choose not to write about it. Another may choose to put it on page 16 as like a 100-word piece, right? So the act of curation and presentation itself is important. So when you're paying for a newspaper, you're also at some level trusting the newspaper and saying that like, this is every day I'm going to rely on partly your worldview as well. I personally feel that it's really important, and I hope we don't end up in a world where there are no newspapers. On the other end of the spectrum, you have what you call views, which is what which I would argue is not just views, but it's like analysis, opinion, insight as well, which is a different kind of product, right? Which I would argue is not for everyone. And for like, for example, if some people just want to know what's happening in Afghanistan right now, what's happening with the Taliban, and like, how soon are they going to take over the country? A lot of the other people want to understand what happened over the last 10 to 20 years. How did we end up here? Could it have been different? What are the options right now, etc. I would argue that both are valuable, and I hope so. I mean, the point that I would like to make is that no one product will probably be able to satisfy our need equally. Some days newspapers will have strong opinion and analysis pieces. Some days they will not have, right? So as consumers, we'll need to come to terms with the fact that there is some amount of work we'll need to do as well, and figure out that, do I want to read news in a newspaper? I'm satisfied with it in Google News? Where am I going to get my analysis from? How many sources do I want to trust? I know it overwhelms people, and they're like, look, I wish there was just one place where I could get everything that I wanted. That's not going to happen. We will have to make some effort ourselves as well. But I mean, to your question, I think both of them are valuable. And if you look at New York Times or Wall Street Journal or Economist, I think let's leave out economists, right? So they do a good job of both news as well as analysis and views as well.
Yeah. So by views, I didn't mean like an opinionated angle to it, but
Yeah, I
analysis.
understood that. Yeah,
The so what rather than the what.
that's right. Or what next? So what?
Yeah.
What next?
Yeah. So what? So what led to this plane crash? What was the history of safety measures in this airline or in this country or in the industry, and what is the role of Boeing innovations, and why was this Boeing model involved in 3 crashes in the last year, and so on, and is there a system flaw there, and what next, what does the industry and that airline needs to do next to make sure this doesn't happen, and so on. So yeah, so that whole thing rather than the plane crashed. If you let me take a couple of minute digression, because it kind of is an amazing parallel to my profession. I'm, as what he was saying, I've been in market research and consumer insights all my life, and I've been hearing about the impending demise of the market research business since I started in this business. In fact, I have myself written about the demise of this industry 20 years ago. I've kind of retracted from that now. The fact was that in the early 2000s, like in every industry, you did not need a human being to write a questionnaire and go out on the street and knock on doors and ask questions. Things were getting, there were easier, cheaper, faster ways of companies to get consumer data through DIY things like Google Form and Survey Monkeys and these kind of things, where you could do your own survey and run your own data visualization, and you cut out the market research industry. Didn't happen. And slowly companies, clients started realizing that what they can get from Google Form is data, the what, but what they can't get from Google Form is the so what. So what if 20% said this and 40% said this and 20% said that? I can make a nice pie chart, or Google Form will make a nice pie chart for me, but so what? What does that mean? What does that 40% mean? And how can I take decisions? What's the insight? What's the story? So story was not coming out by doing automation. You needed human beings who knew consumers to say, this is what it means, and this is what you should do with it. Isn't something similar happening in the journalism business, that the what is now fairly commoditized, and you need journalists to sift through the what and get to the so what and the what next? Do you see that happening?
Yes. I'll begin with, like, that's a very great example. And I'll pick a word that you used, and that which was the story wasn't coming out. So, and this cuts to the core of what we promise at the Ken as well. So we say that we're business storytellers. All of our, like, we don't call them articles. We don't call them, certainly don't call them content. We say we're writing stories, because stories are fundamentally one of the best units to essentially transmit ideas through human mind to human mind, right? So when we started the Ken, before that we did a bunch of surveys, in-person surveys, qualitative surveys, like not at scale, of course. And we asked people that, why do you not read newspapers? Why do you not read business newspapers? Why do you not like business news? And I think one of the things that came across most strongly was that, I don't know, it's too jargony. I don't understand what's going on. Sometimes I feel like it's talking down to me. It's not for me. It's for those people who invest in the stock market. It's not for me. It's people who work in the industry. And from that essentially came for us also the understanding that if you want to make business journalism more relevant to more readers, everything that you write has to be presented as a story, so that it becomes accessible to anyone who's reading it. So it could be a professional, it could be a retired professional, it could be a student, it could be a homemaker. So I think, and that's where human talent comes in, and it's really hard for machines to take over, which is essentially the narrative, connecting the dots and telling the story and saying, this is what led up to this, and this is what's likely going to happen, so that the person who's essentially reading it can form that idea and figure out, oh, I now understand, right? And that's what we do. And in the context of journalism, so it's not just like, so our journalism, for instance, is always, it's reported and original journalism. We don't chase the news. For example, there could be a really big deal that happened in a sector that we're writing on, or there could be an IPO. We're not rushing to cover that tomorrow or day after. Sometimes we'll completely skip it. Sometimes we'll take 2 weeks. But by the time we do it, what essentially our writers, most of whom are like really deeply experienced, they go and talk to people, they report. And this is one of those terms that I think we don't appreciate or understand enough in India, the phrase reporter, right? What do reporters do? They go out and report. How do they report? They essentially talk to various people and piece together the facts and the data, and then they come back and present it as a story. So you're right, like, so can a machine do what we do? Not right now, for sure, right? Like, because like I said, we choose to base it on original reporting and analysis. Now, if we presented our original reporting to some kind of an AI, could it string it together into a narrative? Possibly, maybe to like 70% accuracy. But there's a bunch of stuff that we do, which at least, so for now, I think, to your question, as AI machines, etc., are able to do things like, at scale much better than us, the question for us really is to figure out what are the things that we do better and how can we do them better. For us, it's reportage, analysis, storytelling.
Yeah, so that going up that ladder from base level of this happened to the what is we can call the data, that's your raw data, and then some information on where it happened, when it happened, and so on, and then the insight why it happened, what was the safety record of that airline. Continuing to harp on my plane crash story, what was the safety record of this airline? So 3 other such plane crashes happened which involved the same Boeing, and therefore is there a so connecting those dots, is there a connection between those 3 aircraft crashes with different countries, different airlines, but same Boeing aircraft, and therefore arriving at what we market researchers call the aha moment, when you cracked it, when you figured out the ultimate story and behind
That's
it,
right.
which is so that's what
this requires legwork, this requires reportage, this requires time. And I think this is really important because a typical story that we do takes a writer roughly about 2 weeks to pull off. So for 2 weeks, the writer is not doing anything other than just talking to people, reading up, understanding, analyzing, and then the story that essentially comes out of it is so much more richer for it, right? The only reason why we are able to do that is because our subscribers want that and they pay for that. So we are not in a rush to say, hey, something happened, I got to put out something in 12 hours, in 14 hours, do it. So the business model of journalism creates the kind of the kind of news that you do or the kind of consumers you write for are very closely linked to the kind of business model that you have.
Yeah. So from what I understand, therefore, the talent pool of in journalism is evolving, and I guess it has evolved to some extent in organizations like yours. In the old days, there used to be reporters who just like they had different beats. So some spent their lives sitting outside police stations waiting for the man inside the police station to leak some news of some juicy crime that has been reported to that police station. So there were police station beat and there were business beats sitting outside the stock exchange in Mumbai and so on, whose job was just to pick up news from their insider fixers in those buildings. And then they passed it on, and some other people in the news organization made sense.
Which even today, I would argue, is incredibly valuable, because sometimes it's the beat reporters who get the news out about something which would normally never see the light of the day, right? So it could be that, this company is about to buy that company. Or like you said, there is this airline crash that happened, and this company is trying to bury evidence that they were at fault. So some of those leaks essentially come from those beat reporters who have those relationships that they've nurtured over years and perhaps even decades and stuff like that. So that's incredibly valuable, whether it's from Reuters or from the Times of India or from a Business Standard, etc. Right? And to be fair, to be honest, I think we do have beats as well. Our writers focus on specific, for instance, a colleague may focus on fintech, another may focus on education companies, another on healthcare, etc. But of course, like, their beats are not as real time and instant and scoop based as typical newspaper beats are, where it's just the news is important. So your source tells you that this happened and you quickly rush back and you churn out 400, 500 words to break that news. So for us, it's different. Our sources have long conversations with us, and we're thankful for that. And therefore, what we do is deeper. But many of the stories that we do wouldn't be around if certain beat reporters in newspapers wouldn't have broken the stories and exposed the world to something that's happening.
Okay. So, but your journalists or journalists of this kind, those who are at the moved up the food chain of journalism, so to say, to get into the so what and the what next and the story, are themselves also going out and doing primary data collection, talking to people, or are they collating what comes from these beat reporters? How does the business work?
Yeah, I'll help. And once again, I would I'm very, so there is a continuum, but I would like to call it a horizontal continuum, which is that I don't think that our journalists are higher than a beat reporter. I would just say that on a horizontal continuum, they exist on a different side as opposed to this thing. So I don't want to present it as some kind of a vertical this thing where we are higher and someone is lower than this. It's not that at all. But to your second question, that what do they rely on? They rely on a bunch of stuff. So our stories are based primarily on first person reporting, where we're talking to sources and having deep conversations. We used to go out and physically meet our reporters and writers, right? Of course, and then the pandemic happened. So now a lot of the conversations happen over Zoom, over telephone calls, over Signal, etc. But that feeds the core of our stories. Other than that, we do a lot of secondary research as well, which is what have others written, what are other reports that have come on it, what are other sources of data that we can access. So what we write is typically an amalgam of all of this, but primarily born out of original reporting, which is talking to people who are experts or who are within a company or within a sector. Perfect. So I think our primary job is synthesis. It's basically talking to a bunch of people and reading a lot of stuff, and then being able to see that and synthesize that. So it's not. It's important that this came up because I think synthesis is in many ways the opposite of analysis. To analyze means to look at something and to break it apart and to be able to say that this is what it is. Synthesis is essentially looking at disparate sources of data and information and insight and being able to synthesize it into a coherent story. So we pride ourselves on our ability to synthesize.
Yeah, exactly. Understood. Okay. So just to close the loop on the subscription model, you rightly believe that there is a market for it, and not the whole world will not change to subscription, but even if a small proportion changes, that is a big enough market for serious journalism and for people who really want to understand the so what and the what next, for them to pay for it and get it. Sounds plausible, and that's why you and many other media organizations and some people in the other businesses like music subscriptions or movie subscription or search subscription are going for it. But isn't that kind of putting all your eggs in one basket? What if the subscription model does not take off? Do you have a plan B?
No, we don't have a plan B. I think for any business, if you don't have conviction in the fundamentals of what you're doing and why you're doing it, and if you're thinking that if this doesn't work out, I'll always have a plan B. It's almost like the reality becomes that, because you don't have that conviction. So we're very confident that subscribers will pay for quality news in more and more spheres, and we've seen this evidence all over the world. We've seen this evidence in India, and like there is absolutely nothing in the last 5 years that we've seen which makes us want to say that, hey, what if subscribers don't pay? So the question is, can we become, how, like I told you earlier that we were around 30,000 subscribers right now. How long does it take us to get to 100,000 subscribers? How long does it take us to 1 million subscribers? So in terms of a secular trend, we're very clear that the entire business model of journalism is in flux, and ad funded business journalism, or journalism being the default, is gone. And a sizable percentage of that, and especially the people for whom insight, knowledge, time, etc. are valuable, will shift to subscription journalism. So there's zero doubt in our minds that subscription journalism is here to stay.
Perfect. Yeah, that is the kind of conviction that that's needed to break new ground. As you said, otherwise it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think it might not work, it will not work. Yeah, exactly. So your journalism and the Ken is largely in written long-form stories-based journalism. Have you looked at similar models in other formats like video and audio, like podcasts? Let's start with podcasts and audio, for example. You have a podcast which you run, the Unofficial Sources podcast. Is that also moving, or are you likely to make it into a subscription base? Because right now it's free. And thank you for that, because I'm a regular listener. So, but is that likely to move to a podcast likely to move down the same road, you think?
Once again, same answer. I think a percentage of podcasts are going to become paid. And really the question will come that which are the podcasts that you find really valuable, and do you mind paying for them? So like I said, let's go back to that fundamental question and around first principles, right? If you're spending, let's say, half an hour or an hour of your time switching off from everything and listening to something, and that something is giving you really good value, and you keep coming back to that week after week, fortnight after fortnight, it's 1 hour of your time. Would you feel that it's wrong to perhaps spend, I don't know, whatever, like 100 rupees, 500 rupees, 1,000 rupees on it? I don't see a fundamental reason why many people will not see that as a barrier. A sizable percentage of people may, and I think therefore we will see the default model for podcast still continuing to be free and ad funded, like in news, right? Like the majority model will continue to be, and I don't think that's changing anytime soon, right? But if you look at consumers as a pyramid, right? So the change is not going to come from the bottom, the change is going to come from the top, and it's going to percolate down. So you will absolutely see, and I think a big change that's happening is Apple is going to formally, it's going to start supporting paid podcasts. So the moment, just like the App Store catalyzed the ability for lots of businesses to create an app, which essentially is nothing but a wrapper around the product or services that they provide, and charge for it via Apple's or Google's infrastructure. The ability to create a paid podcast using Apple's infrastructure will spur more and more podcasts, especially which are specialist, niche, or like longer podcasts, to also offer a paid model. Unofficial Sources is going to remain a free podcast for the foreseeable future, but I think you may see us launch new podcasts which are not free. So Unofficial Sources for us is an exception. Everything that we do is, so by the way, you said that our primary form of journalism is long form. It was Like from long form journalism in India, we now have long form journalism out of Southeast Asia. We also have newsletters, and we've got different types of newsletters. We've got a daily newsletter, we've got a weekly newsletter, and we've got more coming along the way. We've got audio. So we are not wedded to any one particular format. We want to evolve with our subscribers as well. Video is probably the only format that I think we're very clear that for the foreseeable future, we don't want to go near it, because I don't think it lends itself very well to what we do. But I think we're very bullish on audio and subscription audio.
Yeah, we'll come to video in a moment, even if you are not going into, but we'll look at it as from an industry point of view. But just staying on audio for another couple of minutes. Audio, and by audio, I largely mean podcast, is still in the stage of being in the Wild West. Everyone, like there's millions of podcasts being thrown out there, largely by small independent podcasters doing their own thing. Some by media houses like the New York Times has a few podcasts, and the BBC has lots of podcasts, and NPR in America, or IVM in India, and so on. These are podcast houses which have lots of podcasts. And when we say they're ad supported, some of them are, but because this is a relatively new sphere, many of them are nothing supported. I think they're just doing it for the love of doing it. And they're not making money, most people in the podcast business. And the large media houses probably are doing it as a storefront, as a way to get people to know about BBC or the New York Times, in the hope that some of them will end up subscribing to their paid products after listening to their podcast. And so will podcast ever become a standalone format, standing on its own legs rather than being supported by other formats or being done for the love of it?
I've very strong and confident views on that. And before that, I think let's just let's look at the reasons why change happens in the media space and in many other spaces as well. So at the Ken, we're huge fans of systems thinking, which is essentially the theory that nothing that you see in the world is in isolation. It's connected to a bunch of other things and events, and it requires, so large scale change requires a system to change. And if you look at the evolution of subscription business models and stuff like that, and if you go back maybe 10 years, 20 years, and you'd see if you look at blogs, like you made the point that some people are just writing or creating podcasts because it's their passion. And you'll see a similar parallel when blogs became. So I used to blog around 2001, 2002, and then I stopped. But it was passion, right? And people used to read news via RSS readers, and there was like a profusion of blogs and stuff like that. And today we've reached a stage where Substack allows someone to monetize their blog very efficiently as a newsletter. It took us a while to essentially get there, but it happened. And for this to happen, multiple things had to fall in place. We needed to have the infrastructure for people to be able to make digital payments. We needed to have the culture where people were comfortable paying recurring charges for various things in a month. We needed to have, content management systems, etc. We needed to have good ways to do all of this. And that same thing will happen in podcasts as well. So podcast as a category was the Wild West because, it's a very open format. No one controls it. Anyone can create a podcast. It's just an audio stream. But you already see that big platforms are trying to standardize it. You see what Spotify is doing. It's saying that, look, you get a subscription. There's a bunch of podcasts that you'll get with it. And some of them are exclusive to us. So in effect, Spotify is already monetizing podcasts through in an indirect manner through their own subscription. You will see Apple starting to introduce paid podcasts through its platforms. So when the large platforms align with these business models, and when you will then start seeing individuals, even those who are doing it as a hobby, realize that, hey, if someone can monetize their newsletter through a Substack, why can I not monetize And I don't think there's anything wrong with it. If an individual is creating something of value, why should we not pay for that so that it sustains that individual's passion and he or she does more of that? So we'll absolutely see that. It may take a while to play out as all these pieces come together in audio, but you'll see that happening as well.
Yeah, certainly. Just as an aside, my neighbors have decided to demolish their apartment right now. So there's some soundtrack to our
All right.
talks. Excuse that.
I
Sorry.
dealt with something similar around a month back, so I completely commiserate with you.
Yeah, these are the joys of working from home. Suddenly they've decided to hammer their house down for some reason. Uh, mm, so, so just to close on the audio bit on podcast, yes, I'm as bullish as you are on podcast. As a consumer, I think in the last 5 years, about 80% of what I know about what's happening in the world and why it's happening is through podcasts. My podcast delivery app tracks my consumption and time spent. I've been averaging 4.5 hours a day listening to podcasts.
Wow.
So which is what makes audio such a good format for the future, because with audio you can multitask. I don't sit for 4.5 hours in one place listening to podcasts. I listen to podcasts when I'm eating, when I'm trying to go to sleep, when I'm commuting, when I'm cooking, when I'm dishwashing, whatever. I'm listening to podcasts while doing other things, so that doesn't add to the time, my total time availability. But to read a long form article or to watch a video, I have to give it my undivided attention. So which is why podcasts will definitely be a large part of the media landscape in the future. So they have to sort their business model out soon, because I would happily pay for podcasts. No one has asked me to pay for it. I'll happily pay
Absolutely.
for it, because
Like
almost everything I get through the podcast. So
that's
I
true.
don't
I
know
think
why they haven't asked me to pay.
so like I said, it's the systemic infrastructure, like everything has to fit together. And now I think is the most confident I've been about that happening in years, right? Because like just Apple saying that we will now support paid podcasts just means that, like, a whole range of people can just plug into that infrastructure and just, like, let Apple take care of it in return for, of course, sharing some part of revenue with Apple, right? So I mean, yeah. And I think the other point that I also want to make is that one of the things that we don't realize when we say we don't want to pay for something that we consume is that we undervalue our time. Like, so you said you spend around 4.5 hours. Even assuming you're multitasking during those 4.5 hours, I would assume that's easily about 1.5, 2 hours of your time in a day, if you were to essentially convert that into dedicated time. Now, if I were to ask you that what is the value, what is the monetary value of those 2 hours in a day? Like, for instance, can I book Professor Miglani's 2 hours every day? What would you charge me for it? It's not going to be free, right? So therefore, like when we are paying for a product which we consume, so I think that's one of the ways that where we will start to realize that it's worth my time, and therefore this money that I'm paying for it is all right.
Yeah, so that is one future that you see, and I fully agree that audio will grow and grow. Okay, just one more passing comment, which you have already alluded to, which is the independent journalists doing their own thing and using kind of third-party platforms to disseminate, like Substack. Do you see that as competition, as threat for you? Because you have paid journalists, high quality journalists with you, dedicated, working for you, and you have the kind of overhead and the costs of running an organization. But a journalist doing the same work, sitting in his room and using Substack to market his long form writing, is that a format you think will grow, and is that competition for you?
So at some level, and this is going to sound like a cliche, I think, like, everything that competes for our time is competition. So if someone chooses to listen to a business podcast instead of reading us, like, for example, you said that perhaps you don't have the time to read a 2,500 word story, 500 word story that we've written, but you would listen to it. Now we've lost you, so we need to figure out, like, is the podcast a competition? Should we become a podcast as well? Similarly, I think newsletter is just a medium. So it's really the insight and the information that's presented. So yes, I think all of us are essentially competing for a subscriber's time and attention. But that said, we're at such an early stage of the shift away from ad-funded mass media business models that I don't think for years we are going to remotely start hitting, the market stage where the market is saturated and we're essentially talking about a zero-sum game. As in, if you're reading this, then it means that, like, I'm not being read. So we don't view it like that. The other point I also like to make is that, like, it's great. Like, I do read a bunch of newsletters as well. Not so many on Substack, but others as well, and some Substack as well. It's great, like, that we're able to do that. But what we do as the Ken is not just that, it's much more. It's like, for example, like I said, like, weeks of reporting, there's incredible amount of editing, there's, like, incredibly rich visuals and infographics that go into our stories as well, stuff like that, right? So what comes out as one story at the end of the day is the tip of the iceberg, right? So underneath that is, like, it, like, to use the phrase, it takes a village. So that's not so it doesn't compare, like, on the same plane for us. I think we'll have the ability to coexist. We will, of course, come out with more newsletters which are closer to the format that you mentioned, which is, I'll use the example of Nutgraph, which is written by my colleague Praveen on Saturdays, which is, closer to the model that you mentioned, which is one person analyzing and writing something for a very passionate audience that really loves that. Like, we do that as well. And I think there's enough space for all of us to coexist, but we don't think that they're comparable or even rival goods.
Perfect. Okay, so we are kind of running out of time, and I can see dozens of interesting questions in the chat box, so we'll get to those. But let's just close with one other format which we didn't talk about much, which you are probably not interested in, but as an industry, video and video format, will that also, you think, move towards subscription based, or has YouTube destroyed that chance at completely?
Yeah, so the way I don't know. I mean, like, I must admit here that I'm a little, my biases will probably start to show here, probably because of my age as well and stuff like that. So for me, so couple of when I said that video is not something that is very important for us, one reason for that is also because video is has very high production time, resource requirements, right? So for a young organization, it takes a lot of, like, for instance, one of our writers can spend 2 weeks reporting and writing a story, and then she can work with an editor, and the two of them can put out something which is incredibly, like, valuable. But if we were to produce even something which is like a similar quality 10-minute video, it would be much, because, like, it's like, what are we saying, what are we editing, where's the studio, who's doing the recording, where is the piece to camera, all of that stuff. That's one part of it. So it's incredibly complex and time consuming. The second is monetization. You used YouTube as an example, is very hard because, like, it's just completely good. Subscriptions may happen, which is YouTube says that, what, like, we are going, or we are creating 2-3 tiers where, like, if you want to watch this amount of video or this quality of video, you can watch it for free. But if you want to watch these shows or these videos, it becomes part of. So I think it's easiest for YouTube to be able to monetize it, or a platform, rather than as an individual player, because I think the incredible value that YouTube provides is distribution at scale. So if you're an individual player, you have to plug into that. Once you plug into that, it becomes almost impossible to charge. So therefore, video is not for us. And I think the last point is that, if you look at video, it's really the the presentation and the storytelling, and if we were to try to apply what we do, which is long form, then we'd be creating half an hour, 45-minute, stories for everything that we do. I'm not really sure how the economics of that or even the viewership of that is going to. So we must choose to do fewer things. We've just chosen not to do video.
So use those resources to get serious about podcasting.
Absolutely.
That's
You'll hear from us very soon.
Perfect. Okay, so last question. Can you give us like a quick rapid fire 3 or 4 predictions on what will the media industry look like 10 years from now? Gazing into your crystal ball, and of course, predictions are always dicey, but any 3 or 4 things that you think we'll see in 10 years from now? And we are recording it, so we'll call you back after 10 years and ask you to defend your prediction.
I'd love to come back after 10 years, but I'd really stay clear of media predictions, and the reason. I think the media industry goes through these ups and downs, up cycles, down cycles, where suddenly everyone's saying that video is the future, Facebook's the future, listicles are the future, BuzzFeed's the future. And then in 2 years, everyone's saying, oh my God, everything's gone. Nobody's people are laying off in newsrooms. So it's incredibly hard to, and it's not entirely our fault, because if you look at the role of Google, the role of the internet, of Facebook, of regulations, of consumer behavior, there is so much of stuff going on that it makes any kind of prediction incredibly hard. For instance, who could have predicted that Google would end up paying millions of dollars to news publishers under threat of regulation from government? Now, how does that change the entire? It entrenches, older and more established companies at the cost of young and innovative ones. Now, who could have predicted something like that coming? But what we'd like to think, so it's interesting that you mentioned a decade. Our ambition over a decade is to essentially get to 1 million subscribers, maybe in less than a decade, right? Like in the 5 to 10 year range from where we are today, can we build a new set of products that allows us to get to 1 million subscribers across text, across newsletters, across podcasts, and across possibly formats that we haven't seen yet. It's incredibly ambitious. It's like one of those moonshot kind of things, but that's what drives us. And that's what keeps us innovating. That aside, I would definitely argue that we'll see newer players emerge, which do not currently are not, which will be worth a lot of money, especially in India and Southeast Asia. Now, this might sound a little self-serving because we also operate in India and Southeast Asia, but I think a lot of the innovation around subscriptions up till now has come from Western markets. And that's largely because consumers there were never completely spoiled. They continued to pay good money for quality journalism in Europe, in US, etc. So therefore, the transition to subscriptions was easier there. But when we look at India and Southeast Asia, I mean, there are similar behaviors that exist across the region, which is lack of trust in the media, unwillingness to pay, lower income levels. So therefore, the kind of subscription models that you will see evolve, the kind of price points, which is going to be very different from what came about in the West. So you will definitely see in that space innovation and strong companies come out. I hope we could be one of them, but like I said, it remains to be seen.
Perfect. That's good to close on. And as you said, predictions in this industry are really fraught with, and it's not just people saying this is the future and this is the killer format and this is the killer app and changing after 2 or 3 years. It's changing after 2 or 3 months. A few months ago, everyone was going gaga about Clubhouse. I don't hear much about Clubhouse now. I don't know what happened to it. It's still there, yeah. I hope, but no one is throwing Clubhouse in my face anymore. So yeah, it's we can never predict that. Okay, I think we we continue the discussion through questions now. Swati, you noticed some good questions?
Yeah, yes, there are a few questions that were sent to everyone, and also some I received them personally. But yeah, thanks Rohin and thanks Professor Meglani. It was a very engaging conversation, and Rohin showed us pretty well that how the global trends have, and especially when it comes to India and Southeast Asia, how the Ken is going to be the torch bearer of such news.
I certainly hope so. Thank you for that.
Yeah, so I will take the opportunity to ask the first question Mr. Prabhu had asked, but I think he won't be able to come on camera and ask. So Rohin, Mr. Prabhu wants to know that why does the Ken not have a pay per article per view model as well? Like if I want to read a specific article just once.
Yeah, so we do have, and we've had one for, I think, a couple of years now, right? Which brings me to the second part of the answer. So you can read any article at the Ken by just paying for that one article. Now, the subtext in this question is that it should be, so let me also reveal what we charge for an article. So it costs 500 rupees to pay for a single article as opposed to 3,245 for an annual subscription. So when most people ask that, is there a pay per article, they're implicitly also saying, is there a cheap pay per article model? We do not offer that. We do have a pay per article model, but we don't offer a cheap pay per article model. And that, let me explain, right? Because we're talking business models here. So the subscription business model directly conflicts with a pay per article. So to use the example of when you subscribe to an Apple Music or Netflix, what would it cost? Sometimes you notice that a particular movie is not on that, right? But you can pay for it separately on iTunes, and it costs $10 or $15. Or if you go to a restaurant that is primarily known for serving buffets, and you say, I want to order a la carte, and then you expect that a la carte pricing to be a fraction of the buffet, it doesn't work like that. So the moment we start offering really cheap pay per article pricing, it takes away the reason for someone to subscribe to us. And we really want subscribers to subscribe to us and trust us and experience our journalism over a period of time. But if we don't have the conviction, and if we don't encourage subscribers to have that conviction by saying, you don't need to subscribe, you can just pay us 5 rupees or 10 rupees and read that, then we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot. So yeah, I mean, and by the way, I think we still get a decent number of people who do pay us 500 rupees per article to read, because it's choice, and we want to give subscribers that choice.
Okay, thank you. And that was nicely explained through that analogy. And Mr. Prabhu had, I think he had posted two questions. There was one more. He asked that removing ads does not remove the journalist bias from the article. How do you prevent that from affecting the quality of the article? I think that was cursorily touched somewhere in the conversation, but yeah, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, so it's not journalist bias, it's journalist experience and views, right? So if you want to remove bias from the presentation of news, then I think the only reliable way to do that is to have a software writer. But even that, I would argue, is impossible, because that software would be coded by human beings, so that bias is going to creep into that. So there is no journalistic model which is devoid of bias, right? That's, I mean, if you want that model, then that's an encyclopedia. An encyclopedia presents facts, but just the connection of events and news and the significance has to be strung together through a human being who's applying their mind. Now, some may choose to see that as bias, but most of our subscribers see that as experience and insight that they pay for.
Okay. We had one of our students, Rutva, who had shared some of her comments in the chat box as well. You could have read that. Rutva, would you like to come on camera and ask a question to Mr. Dharmakumar? Hi, Rutva.
Hello.
Hi. Yes, Rutva, you may, yes, please.
My question is already written in the chat box that I was trying to convey that every like just as Ken, everyone are presenting some news and facts. But what I was thinking that we should also post something which could empower or which could solve the problems, which is going people going through something. I think that there must be something which people could rely on or trust. It's not just news and facts which build our life. There are so many other objectives too which needs to be discussed, and some of them are not, just because someone doesn't have that courage to speak up or be the voice. So what I was thinking that journalism could do that for the people who couldn't speak. Journalism could be the voice for them and present it in front of everyone, so we all get to know that these problems are also going through, like people are also going through these kind of problems which need to be taken seriously or treated. That's what I was.
Absolutely. So Ruta, you're absolutely right. Like, and I would just like to present, the case that we don't like, we are just a drop in the ocean of journalism, right? So many of the things that you said are done very well by individuals who are writing a newsletter or publications that choose to focus on any one sector, etc. Right? So there's a bunch of people, such institutions and individuals out there. My only request would be, we as consumers, when we find those that are doing this work that appeals to us, I think we should try and support them. And when I say support, I mean support them financially by trying to subscribe or donate to them, because that's the way we see journalism starting to reflect what we want it to reflect, right? As long as it's being funded by sponsors, advertisers, etc., there will always be this disconnect where we say that, look, I don't trust, they're not saying something that I want, right? So the only way to establish that, or the best way to establish that, is to find them. And once you find them, talk about them, support them, etc. We don't do everything. We will never do everything, but I think there's enough and more people do. And I need to encourage that diversity.
Thank you, Rohin. So Professor Preeti Manik is here with us. She is a professor at Ahmedabad University. Professor Manik, you had a question, and would you like to come on camera and ask?
Yeah. Hello. I really learned a lot from your talk, and I've been an avid consumer of social media, especially YouTube, and I find that there is a subscription-based model there as well. And also they invite donations, and there is something called Patreon, where people can just pay whatever they want. And I have very often contributed to channels which I really like, whose content I really like. So what do you think about that form of subscription? And my second question is to do with my profession, learning. So could we also have a subscription-based model in teaching particular subjects, so students can just choose, we can choose like cafeteria, that I want to learn this and I want to take these kind of lectures, and I can kind of pay for that especially.
Sure. Thanks, ma'am, for that question. Both of those questions, and I think both of those are really strong trends. The first one is, of course, viewers or consumers paying to support like either a YouTuber or a creator through Patreon, stuff like that. And I think that's really strong. There have been multi-billion-dollar platforms that have been created out of that, and they're based largely on the microtransactions where people are sending $1, $5, $10, 10 rupees, 20 rupees. It all adds up, right? So I think that's definitely going to. It's incredible, because even through something like TikTok, which now unfortunately is banned in India, and a bunch of their clones, you have the ability for someone in a smaller town who's talented at something, right, to be able to not just reach an audience, but try to solicit their financial support through this kind of a model. I really feel that this is going to explode much more, especially for countries like India, right? Microtransactions of this form. And to your second question, learning again is like incredibly, like, the rise of edtechs in India, which are rather like, the big platforms, to again, like, we will see, like we're already seeing to a large extent in Western markets, but also in India, where someone will come up and offer a course which is valuable, and maybe it costs 1,000, maybe it costs 10,000, maybe it's 4 hours, maybe it's a class where you gather 5-10 people. So I think the disruption of traditional education into the 4-year model or the 3-year model, where like into like I will pay what I want to learn when I want to learn, and from the best. It doesn't have to be in India. Like, for example, if you look at the masterclass model, which started in the US, where you have famous artists, actors, etc. And now it's there in India as well. There are 2-3 venture funded companies that are doing that, which is, I want to learn acting and I want to learn it from an actor. And I'm just going to subscribe and learn from it. And that's the best teacher. Both of these are incredibly powerful subscription models of a different kind. And I'm really thrilled about, we cover both of these and we look at these and we're really excited about both of these. So, but I think it goes back to that earlier point that I made, that you're supporting people that you like, who produce information and knowledge that you like. And I think more and more of us will do that. And that will create the next generation of like, creators and knowledge makers.
If I can just add a bit to that, Rohan. Hi, Preeti. On the second part of it, the education part of it, which is what I'm more familiar with, is, yeah, as Rohan said, that's already happening. And things like Coursera and Google certifications and so on. So piecemeal, pick and choose kind of education offerings are already there. But as in media, as Rohan explained to us earlier, it's not either or. And again, there have been people sounding alarm and saying the 4-year university education is dead. That will not die, just like old form journalism will not die. There is space for people to get a well-rounded interdisciplinary education covering everything over a 4-year degree. And then there is room for doing side hustles, go and do a data analytics course here and a digital marketing course there and a people management course there. Not only while you're doing this well-rounded 4-year, but also through life. In the old days, in my days, they used to be like, you study for first 25 years of your life, then you work for the next 35 years of your life, and then you retire. That model is gone. We are learning all the time.
Continuous learning.
Continuous learning. And continuous learning will happen through these menu-based pick and choose. Because now I've reached a stage in my career where I need to learn analytics or data visualization or something which was not taught to me when I was in university 20 years ago. So I do pick and choose and do one thing. So that is already happening.
I completely agree. As a father to an 11-year-old, like, I cannot think of, him choosing not to have like, the valuable experience of that, like, undergraduate degree and possibly, postgraduate degree, because, I don't think it can be compared. And I hope that like, they will continue to coexist and, their value will go up. You're right, like, it's a continuum. So everything is like a horizontal continuum, and it's nothing which is above or below, but I think it's just depending on our stages in life and needs, we'll just pick and choose what works for us.
Yeah, I've been, and we have all been seeing these stories which say, okay, in university, you do over this course, you do 80 credits, you attend 35 courses. Now pick these 35 courses on Coursera and Google certification. See, you can do it in 6 months at a fraction of the cost. So forget the degree. It doesn't work like that. And so we should not panic.
Plus, I think there is something to be said about the richness of the experience of college itself, though it can sound kind of self-serving, but I think, to go back to your earlier points about what is it that machines can do and what is it that humans can do, I think, the richness of the human experience cannot be replicated easily by like, by something which is entirely online. And like, therefore, over time, we will see the best colleges and the best courses become even more valuable. And I would argue more expensive because it's hard to replicate that offline.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Swati.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Manik. We have Sujit, who had, I think, 2 or 3 questions he posted in the chat box. So Sujit, would you like to ask your questions?
Hello. Yes, am I audible?
Yeah, yes.
Yes, Sujit.
Sure. Hi, Rohin. Yes. So first of all, congratulations for building such a wonderful and respectable brand in business journalism space. I've been a fan of your writing, and especially I mean, been a fan of Pravin's writing also. I look forward every time for his nut graph. So I have 3 specific questions.
Thanks,
I'm not
Sujit.
sure whether I'm allowed to ask 3 questions or not, but I'll still go ahead and quickly ask those 3 questions. First of all, is there any specific barrier to scale for business subscription journalism, right? So you mentioned you are 35,000 subscribers right now and you want to scale up to 1 million. But is there any ceiling, especially for a paying audience in India? And how do you kind of want to break that ceiling and move to, say, a 1 million subscriber? That's my question 1. Second, I would like to know your views on the subscription model for media houses that are specifically into political journalism. So, what I see is that business journalism is not as polarized as political journalism. But when you come to political journalism, you'll always find those labels of left wing, right wing into every media house. So does that limit the audience? Does that deter people from subscribing to it? Or will that political journalism remain a sponsor based or a donation based or an ad based journalism? That's my second question. And third question is, so you were talking about podcast. So is there even a real scalable market for podcast in India? I was reading one of your articles only where you said that if you have 4,000 downloads, you are in top 1% of subscribers, 1% of podcast worldwide. And there are so many thousands of content creators which are entering into this space. So is there a real model, scalable model in podcast as well, or will that be just another fad which is there? So like Professor Miglani was saying that, in audio space, the podcasting space is something where you don't really want to pay. You can do multitasking as well, whereas you have to kind of go through a long form article. But I've also seen people who are actually taking time out and especially listening to podcasts, but they can skim through an article in much shorter time compared to listening to a podcast. So is there any consumer insight that you have observed of such kind as well? Thank you. These will be my 3 questions. Yes.
Let me start with the last one, which is podcasts. Okay. And see, I think the question, like whenever we look at, especially in media, there is this tendency to look at a new trend and say, will everyone move to it? Will everyone pay for it? Right? And I think the counter to that is and again, very relevant for media, is this very famous, theory called 1,000 true fans. That in the modern internet economy, all an individual needs to be successful is 1,000 people who will support her or him for whatever they're doing, right? So the question is, if you're a podcaster and if you believe that you're creating something of value, can you find 1,000 people who will really value it enough to pay, I don't know, 10 rupees, 100 rupees? So I think we have to always start from that. I think there is this tendency to view everything from this top-down model, which is also one of the, I think, the classic, I think, traps which carried over from all the FMCG marketing times and stuff like that, where it's like, what is the overall market is this? What is the demographics? What is the income level? Okay, SECA is this much. Maybe I can capture 2% of that. So my market is this. I don't think modern businesses, especially startups, get built like this. They get built up from the bottom up, where you're like, I'm creating something. Can I find 100 people who will pay for it? Can those 100 be made into 1,000, 10,000? And then you work your way upwards. As you go upwards, now obviously it may become more diffused. You may reduce pricing, etc., and stuff like that. So if you go back to that logic, and if you ask, you're a podcaster and you're producing something, can you find 100 people, 1,000 people who will pay you for it? And I think that's the hardest question. If you believe you can, you should absolutely do it. But if you can't, then there's no point looking at how crowded the space is, because it's irrelevant. You're not targeting the entire market. You're only targeting those 1,000 people, 100 people who you want to listen to your podcast. So that's one. Second, I think, was your, sorry, what were your questions?
Yes, so the second question was around political journalism, and will
Yeah,
subscription
so
model-
I don't think it's about the bias. It's not that people, like, if it were merely about the bias, then I'd say then absolutely, like, you can split the entire market for political journalism into two halves, and one half can monetize, those who are interested in, let's say, the left side of the spectrum, and the other half can monetize. But I don't think that's a problem. I don't think it's, the problem is that people, again, like, I'm going to use probably an exaggeration, that people like to read about politics to stay informed and aware of what's going on. They probably don't feel that it adds a significant amount of value to their life to be able to want to pay for it, right? So if you're a sports fan and you want to read about your football teams or cricket teams, there is something at a personal level for you, and you want to kind of pay for it. I don't, and this is my personal theory, right? So you will see people supporting their political journalism outfit through a donation or subscriptions. But personally, I'm not entirely sure, because it's not just in India. I don't think anywhere around the world we've seen sustainable subscription based political journalism model. There is a Politico Pro in the US. I'm not really sure how many subscribers it has, etc., and stuff like that. So it's not an India thing, and it's not a left versus right thing. It's really about, do individuals view political news as something which is really impactful for them and worthy enough to pay for it? And what was your first question?
Right. So my first question was, are there any barriers to scale in subscription journalism in
India? Again, I'll go back to the first, thing that, when we started, what was the barrier? I don't know. I mean, honestly, you start from the bottom and you work your way up. Can we ever hope to become 1 million subscribers by charging people 3,245 for a year? Absolutely not. Can we hope to reach 1 million subscribers by just doing one long form story a day? Absolutely not. So it will get fractured along the way, where possibly some people are paying us perhaps 100 rupees. Someone else is paying us 10,000 rupees. Someone else is paying us 200 rupees. Somebody's consuming a podcast. Somebody's consuming a newsletter. Somebody's reading a long form. But I think it's a sum total of all of these that we're talking about. So, and the more classical answer to your question is, do you believe that there is a income barrier that prevents, forget Southeast Asia, just in India itself? Let's say we're talking about the willingness or the ability to pay, say, 1,000 rupees a year. Do we believe that there is not there is not like a market that can touch 1 million? Of course, there is no such barrier. It's a mindset barrier, right? So it's an awareness barrier. It's a distribution barrier. I don't think it's like a affordability or any such kind of financial barrier.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Very insightful.
Thank you. So, Rohan, can we take a few more minutes from you? We have a few more questions. So we've already passed 5:30, but yeah, there are a few around 3 or 4 more questions. Thank you. So there are 2 questions from another faculty colleague, Amol Agarwal. He won't be able to come on camera, but I'll ask on his behalf. Amol writes a very popular blog, mostly economics. And he had a very interesting question coming to academics. So when it comes to students, it's very difficult to convince them to read newspapers. Right. So, and the Ken has special subscriptions for institutions, right? So do you design your product in a way that is student friendly, or that and nudges students to read it, or, it's the same? And how do we convince students to read such articles?
Yeah, this is a great question. And this is something that I would like to say we planned for it, but we stumbled into, because when we started in 2016, just the notion that will we be able to convince, our original assumption was that people who are working professionals and well earning will be able to pay and therefore want to read long form journalism on business. Along the way, we stumbled into the fact that more and more students started writing to us and saying, I'm a student, I can't afford your subscription, but I want to read. So then we start figuring out, hey, I mean, there are students writing, and that's how we ended up creating the campus subscription, which, by the way, like, I mean, I think most of the leading, I think we have like, close to 20 campuses in India that subscribe to us. And it was really surprising when we got our first Indian campus subscriber, which was the Indian School of Business. And but FYI, we do not do anything different for subscribers, student subscribers or campuses. And our original assumption was that we got to do something because we came with that notion that, hey, millennials don't read, and millennials certainly don't read long form, and they're not interested in business news. And we've been completely wrong about that. And it probably goes back to the fact that if you present information as a story and with a point, and which allows you to see what's coming, students, especially postgraduate students, especially those in B schools, etc., are no different from the rest. So I think all of us, and I think the connected question is that I remember, like, when I was in school, and like, when we were in college as well, for our, like, MBA, I think the thing was, you should read the newspaper, right? And we just had a discussion about this at the Ken with a colleague last week. And why? Because, it would tell us about the stock markets, about business and stuff like that, right? But that same thing today puts people off, because I don't think somewhere along the way we've evolved, because no longer it's like, why do I want to read about stock markets? Why do I want to read about, like, these dense things? People have that choice, right? And just keeping on top of information is no longer enough. So when you say that, like, you got to read the newspapers, thankfully, I think the current generation is much more aware and has the willingness to say, I don't see a point, right? We didn't have much of a choice, like, and so we read it. People do have the choice today, and they say, it's not for me, I'll just read it on Google News and stuff like that. So we've been incredibly surprised, pleasantly surprised with the way campuses and students have turned out to us. We don't customize currently, but we're talking to students and campuses to figure out if there's anything that we need to do around the space of, for instance, more modern and contemporary case studies based on Indian businesses and situations. But as of now, I think we're as is.
Okay, thank you for sharing what's going on right now in this area. And Amol had another question that, and of course, you don't come from a journalism background, so his question is like, what are the expectations from young students if they want to enter into journalism, especially those who are not coming from that education background?
Okay, this is a very it's a very complex and loaded question, because fewer and fewer, like, largely because of the historical crisis of journalism over the last maybe decade or so, fewer and fewer promising youngsters view journalism as an industry where they want to enter, because, and I understand their point of view, it's like, should I enter, quote unquote, a dying industry, or one that refuses to move with the times, right? That's a valid criticism. But that's changing. And I think a large parts of that is due to the way digital businesses have evolved and subscriptions has evolved. The second question, which is, what should you expect? Now, while it's great if you've trained in journalism and studied journalism, but at the end of the day, I think journalism is the kind of profession where if you're really interested in it, and if you're diligent about it, that's all that it takes, right? Because at the end of the day, what is it that you do? You talk to people, you understand, like, data and information that's out there, and you string it together and you write it. I'm a huge believer in the fact that almost 99% of professions in the world don't require any rocket science, as long as you're reasonably smart and willing to put in hard work. That's definitely true of journalism. So if you're interested and passionate about journalism, that's all that it takes. But it's not a profession that you can kind of just amble into. I mean, you can say that, why, fine, I'll enter like, investment banking because I may not be interested in it, but at least there's money in it, right? So you don't enter journalism because I'm not interested in like, journalism, but hey, at least there's money. I mean, there is money in it in some spaces, but so you got to like you got to have that um, that yearning to tell a story, to reveal the truth. It sounds cliched, but really that's what brings a lot of us into journalism and keeps us here.
Okay. Thanks, Rohin. And there is a question from Veena. Veena may again not come on camera, but she would ask the question on her own. Veena, would you like to please ask the question?
Yes. Hi. So I did ask a question in the chat box, but I would like to ask it in a slightly modified form right now. So recently the Ken started using polls for some of their stories. Like I remember for the vaccine story and the online education story recently. So my question is, what is the motivation for using polls in stories? Because as far as I know, you're getting those polls answered through your social media and the website. So it's not like there's a lot of people to whom the poll is reaching, or it's more representative in terms of the demographics. Then why do it? And the sort of a follow-up question is that, so I did work as a research assistant for a professor in the summer break, and I experienced firsthand what people mean when they say that it's hard to come across data in India. So is there any hint of this problem in your reason to have your own polls for your stories as well?
Very interesting questions, Veena, and thanks for asking us this. The why did we start polls, and I explain when we started, and for a large part of our existence, it was a one-way relationship between us to our subscribers. We produce journalism, they consume it, and then that feedback loop, some of it gets established because subscribers comment on our stories or they write an email back, so there is some kind of a feedback loop, right? But I think at some point, once we reached a certain scale with our subscriber community, we realized that, again, to go back to systems thinking, that this is where, this is the Ken, this is our subscriber community. It's not a one-way relationship, but essentially we're in a feedback loop where it's not just valuable for our community to know what our writers are writing, but it's valuable for us and the rest of the community to know what. So this came from a lot of people who would write to us and say, I would love to know what the Ken subscribers think about this, right? Or a lot of people would say, sometimes the comments are more valuable than the story itself. We are not thin-skinned enough that we take offense. In fact, we took delight in it, because for us, it was a sign that our subscriber community is as valuable as our stories itself. So that's when we said that, look, I mean, if people want to know what are comments, what do other subscribers think, and I think polls is a great bridge between our journalism and to our community, because they draw from our stories and journalism, and they draw responses from our community, and they essentially kind of create this. You're right, it's absolutely not a statistically valid poll, because our demographic skews in a particular direction, right? Because it's professionals, certain income, skewed towards Bangalore, Delhi, Bombay, and larger cities, etc. But within that, I think there's incredible value in understanding that what do other subscribers like me think about, what are their views. That's the only thing that's guiding us. And it's early days with this, but I think you will see us spend much more time on polls, but with the same philosophy that we want to know what our subscribers are thinking, and other subscribers want to know what subscribers are thinking, and we're all connected in this kind of like a feedback loop.
Thank you, Veena, for your question, and thanks, Rohin. Rohin, we have one more student, Anuj, who was very actively engaged with us when we were promoting the webinar in the university, and he had a lot of questions. Maybe he'll come forward and ask one of those right now. So yeah, Anuj, Please, you can come on camera and ask the question.
Yeah, I would love to come on the camera, but I'm right now not a good network coverage area, and I'm already lagging. Mr. Rohan, I really love the way you have a very clear focus of who your customers are, and that is something that lacks in the industry. Like just to give an example, like Money Control has that 1 rupee per day, and that free discount model just takes all the fun out of journalism as a whole. So the way you started, you answered a lot of my questions, that you have a very targeted focus, that you don't want to cover the entire country or the South Asian part. But my question to you was that it depends on another question, that who are your target audience? Who are you targeting as Ken? Because I was looking through your website and I was looking through the articles that you had posted, the free ones. So I was confused as who am I? How do I identify myself as a customer to you? What kind of segments do you look at when you look at a customer?
All right. This is going to sound kind of heretic, but we don't really write for a particular set of segments, and that's by design. And I think a large part of that credit should go to my co-founder and our editor Seema. That when we started, our point was that, look, what's our driving mission, and what gets us to potentially 1 million subscribers over a decade? It's if we are able to make business journalism more accessible to as wide a set of readers as possible, which means that, like, for instance, my mom reads my stories, right? She's got our app installed on her iPad, and she reads the stories. Now, I'm incredibly proud of that. And I want more of that to happen, right? So for us, it's like we're writing a story, and it should just be a great story. It should not, like, for instance, if you're writing a healthcare story, and we're incredibly great at healthcare, right? Like, I would argue that our journalism is one of the best in the healthcare space in India. Should it mean that only if you're a healthcare professional that article is relevant for you? Should it not be relevant if you're a parent? Should it not be relevant if you're just, a lay person or a student? So therefore, for us, we have an understanding of who are our subscribers, or chunks of it, professionals, founders, VC, students, etc. But we also, so we don't chase them, and we certainly don't ask for that information. So this is one of our philosophies, right? We don't try and collect data about our subscribers. So we don't know the gender of our subscribers. We don't know their ages. We don't know anything much about them. So to your question, we are not writing for a particular set of users, because that often implies that you're doing something very specific for them and you're excluding others. We just want to write great stories which anyone can read and say, and we get these mails all the time where people will say that, look, I am so and so, or I'm just a student, or I'm a homemaker, or I'm a retired professional, and I just discovered you folks, and I just love reading your stories. And there is no professional reason for them to read those stories. And that's really, some of those mails are the ones that really delight us the most, because it means that we're somewhere along the way, we're succeeding in our mission. So it's by design that you don't feel that we are targeting a particular segment through our journalism.
Thanks, Anuj. And Rohan, 2 more questions and not beyond that.
Hello.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I just had one follow-up question. Sorry, okay. The idea was to ask something else. So basically, when you say that, as a customer, as a reader, I have a subscription for Forbes as well as I have a subscription for WSJ, and I do also read Flipboard, which is a free, news articles that I read. So I have an interest in politics as well as finance. So what makes you, as a customer, how would I go to Ken as a subscriber? Because I also love the pay model of journalism, but why would I subscribe? This is not just I'm trying to understand how it works, but comparison to WSJ or Forbes, where I get really relevant information, how does Ken try to compete with them, or how does it make you different with them?
Yeah, we don't. So for instance, you cannot get from a Wall Street Journal what you get from the Ken, and vice versa, right? So it's not a zero-sum game. So the journalism that we do, the areas that we focus on, the depth that goes into our stories, the language in which we tell our stories, our reportage, etc., is unique to us. Now, it obviously means that there's a set of readers for whom that's valuable. Now, will they also pay separately for Wall Street Journal? Perhaps. I do, by the way. I'm a paid subscriber to Wall Street Journal as well, right? But they're not comparable products. So we don't compete with the Wall Street Journal unless you feel that a subscriber's wallet has reached that limiting point where they can either subscribe to the Ken or to the Wall Street Journal. In which case, really, I think subscribers will decide which is more important for them: a global perspective, lots of news every day, or something which is much more sharper and narrower on India and Southeast Asia on a fewer sectors.
Thank you so much, Rohin. It was really nice to listen to you and your views about this. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anuj and Siddharth. Yeah, now you can come. Sorry for keeping you waiting.
No. Yeah, Rohan, it was a great insight that you have provided. So I have a question, because that's something that we work with. There is a concern that there's a power of tech platforms that remains a great concern for all publishers, irrespective of whether they are independent or they're regulated by a firm. And there are mixed views on how they get regulated, specifically the tech platforms. What are your views on regulations around these platforms, and what will it take to get these platforms be more free, to gain such freedom from any kind of biases or any?
I'd like to skip this answer because I think this. To be honest, I think this is a very, very, very complex issue, and I don't think even if I spent half an hour on it, we wouldn't cover it, and it would be my extremely personal view. And to be honest, so I just can't answer that. Tech platforms are powerful. They also provide a lot of value, and different countries are going about the problem, solving that problem in different ways. I'm not sure what India's way is right now, to be honest. I don't see a very clear strategy, but I know there is something that will emerge, because it is but I don't know. I mean, it's just, I would say it's out of scope.
Oh, not a problem.
Or out of syllabus.
Yep. Thank you. Not a problem.
Okay. Kaushik, and this is the last question, Rohin. Just a heads up. Kaushik, you may come forward and ask the question.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we
yes.
can. Yes.
Hi, Rohin. This is such a nice conversation, and I buy the business model, the subscription model. And I also buy the podcast future that you are predicting. So I have a question relating to the communication between the journalist and the domain expert. So can you share your experience and your suggestion for scientists or domain expert when you have podcast conversation? We have seen that during this COVID time, the communication of the risk, the evidence, these are not properly communicated to the policymakers and to the others. And maybe because of the less good communication skill of the scientists, of the domain expert, you have any suggestion for such scientists?
It's like a very important, I think, issue that you bring up, which is most news or media is their job is to take something which is important and complex and simplify it and present it to a large set of readers, right? So there is inherent in that a certain transmission loss of accuracy or risk, etc., and stuff like that. It's a really complex issue, and I don't think there are any easy answers. Mistakes have been made by the world's most important, there's evidence that the biggest news organizations and even scientists underestimated how things would play out so I don't think we can just blame journalists, right? It's like a lot of us do. And then, we swung to the other extreme where everyone started playing safe. And then we started assuming that everything is a risk, right? And nothing, right? So I can only say that, science and scientists will also like, need to understand that storytelling is an important skill. And I think more, we've seen that especially during the last year and a half or so, we've seen scientists around the world start their own blogs and Twitter feeds and present data and their stories in very compelling ways. And I think that's important. So it's not like, if we can have more scientists present their views, like, and like, learn to write and like, sorry, I mean, let me take that back. It's not learn to write. Of course, they know how to write, right? But it's like write for lay readers, because scientists know how to present facts and argue for experts or peers, etc., right? But they also need to know how to communicate their points in a compelling manner. And believe me, that's incredibly hard, right? Just like journalists find it hard to think and write like scientists will find it hard to. So therefore, I just hope, like, we can have more scientists who communicate directly instead of, like, it's not either or, right? The bulk of science, when it's presented to the public, will continue to get, I think, simplified, and I think that's good on balance. But I think even if we can see 10% scientists present their own point of view directly to readers without being filtered or retold, that's so. I think storytelling for scientists should become a much more critical skill going forward. The platforms exist, Substack exists, YouTube exists, all of these exist, right? Scientists just need to understand that they got to use it. And I think the pandemic has shown them that they should. In fact, humanity requires them to essentially do that.
Thank you, Rohin.
Thank you, Kaushik, and thanks, Rohan, for emphasizing that even academic writing and storytelling now needs to go hand in hand. So, Rohan, I mean, I think we've covered everything that was coming in the chat, most of the things. But if there was something that you found, something that we missed out, and you would like to address, you may please do that.
I'm sorry, I must admit that, like, that, like, I wasn't paying attention to the chat messages because I was like, if there's something, like, which is, maybe we can take one final question if there's something that anyone feels, or maybe I'll just scroll through if you just give me a minute.
Yeah, sure.
I think I'd seen a question somewhere about, how many, okay, yeah, let me just take that last question, right? How many concurrent subscriptions will a reader be willing to pay for? This is a common question. And the answer to this is that how many TV channels are you willing to pay for? Or how many different types of artists are you willing to listen to? There is no one answer to this. I think this is happening because we're moving away from that model where we read a newspaper and that's being disintermediated to now a plethora of choices. So we're in that, like, I think twilight zone where we're feeling that there's too much. This just doesn't make sense. We yearn, for a return to the older model where things were simple. One person or one entity would just give me all that I wanted from news. Unfortunately, that's not coming back. I said this early on in the conversation as well. We'll need to make a choice, right? Like, how much, like, if you feel news is really important for you, you'll probably subscribe to 10, 20 subscriptions, which, like, for instance, I do. If you feel that one or two publications are enough, and then, like, Google News or, like, direct websites are enough, that's all right. I think all of us will need to find our balance. There is no one right answer.
Thank you. Professor Miglani, if you'd like to just give us the closing remarks, and then.
Yep. Yes, yeah, there's not much of a remark to add. This has been very comprehensive. I think we've covered everything very well. I'll probably make two quick comments. One is just to continue on the question from Kaushik and the response to that. I have worked in the commercial world most of my life, and the last couple of years I'm in the academic world, and that is my pet peeve as well, that so much good academic writing doesn't get to the lay public in its real form, because academic writing gets mostly written in academic journals, which other academics read, and it's kind of a closed loop, and the wider world doesn't know. And the risk in that is that what the wider world gets is a lay journalist picks up a paper and kind of oversimplifies it and dumbs it down and then makes it into a sensational news item. And that's what people end up seeing. So to avoid that, scientists need to come out of the loop of talking to other scientists and start talking to the public and explaining science, which many are doing, explaining science in real scientific way, but in layman language, not in academic journal language. So that is certainly an opportunity. So Kaushik, maybe you want to pick up on that opportunity and run with it.
Sorry, if I can just interrupt, Professor Miglani. I think this is especially true for business, research in India, because we see, like, there's great examples in the West, like lots of, like, professors, researchers, etc., who do incredibly, like, interesting research, and they present it as stories, as books, etc., and stuff like that. But I don't think we've scratched the surface in India. Like, we're like, what's happening in our workplaces, what's happening around innovation, what's happening around economics, all of the PhDs, all of the research that's taking place in India's colleges, I think they'd make for, like, interesting stories. I wish we'd see more of that as well in India. So you're absolutely right. It's not just scientific, it's like business as well.
Yeah, scientific, business stories, economics, all of that. Told by scientists so that it's not dumbed down. It's simplified to in a language that a layperson can understand, but not sensationalized and dumbed down. Sorry, Kaushik, you wanted to come back on that?
Yeah, just a follow-up question. Do you suggest that the such journalists which should have a even small journalism training?
Journalism for scientists, yeah.
So I think the training is not so much the journalism training as it is I think it's a presentation of ideas and, like, the communicating to the writer, like, because journalism training would also imply a lot of where are you getting your facts from, how are you presenting it, like, how you like I think scientists already have that critical faculty with them, right? It's the act of writing or presenting that in really powerful narrative. So it's like storytelling training, narrative training, that and absolutely, I think, like, it's required. Just like journalists need, all of us do need, like, training on statistical analysis or how to do research or how to read this thing, like, so there's some kind of a midway meeting point where we all become better and more accurate storytellers in the process.
Great. So let's end and on that note. So one thing that I have learned today is, like in everything, those screaming headlines saying universities are dead and Google certificates is the future, or work from office is dead and work from home is the future, and journalism is dead and free Google News is the future. None of these screaming headlines work. Ultimately, everything reverts to the mean. So yes, there will be free news, and yes, there will be subscription. Yes, there'll be universities, and yes, there'll be menu-based courses online. So certainly there is enough room for subscription-based, good quality journalism, which people are willing to pay for, and especially in podcasts. I hope.
I know you have a vested interest, and I'm happy for that, because then we can come to you when we're doing something new, and I know I can count on your opinion. Thanks so much.
Good. Okay. Thank you so much, Rohin. We kept you much longer than we had contracted for.
It was a pleasure.
And let's stay in touch. We can surely do something together.
Thank you, Ravi.
Maybe picking up on Kaushik's idea, maybe some kind of storytelling training for our researchers and scientists and so on. Yep, let's see. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Swati.
Thank you, Rohin, and thanks to our audience for staying with us for so long. Rohin, we will be sharing a YouTube recording with you soon. Thank you. Thanks a lot.